Meeting's being recorded. I'd like to begin the meeting by making an acknowledgement of country and by acknowledging that this is the unceded land of the Brihadiraniko people of the Darug Nation upon which I'm sitting, and I pay respects to the elders of the past and the present, and I am so grateful to them for the custodianship of the land, which has made it possible for us to be here. All right, so yeah, welcome everybody. I'm really happy to have everybody here, and I'm really happy to be able to teach a course on this, one of my favorite pet topics. And I'll give you kind of a bit of a warning. Hopefully you have had a chance to have a look at Jayatilake's book. You probably won't have been able to borrow it from the Buddhist library, and well, we won't worry too much about who's guilty for that reason. But anyway, thank you for the Buddhist library for letting me have a copy. Just checking the due dates here. It was borrowed once in 2000 and then twice in 2009. So safe to say, perhaps not the most popular book on the Buddhist library shelves. And the reasons for that are fairly obvious, right? It's pretty dense. It does not, it's not kind of making apologies or, you know, it's a pretty kind of scorched earth approach to Buddhist philosophy. It's like, it's not doing any hand holding whatsoever. And, you know, I read this book many years ago for the first time, and, you know, I've always found it incredibly rich. But I think it took me, you know, quite a number of years to be able to really sort of understand where he was coming from. And to really appreciate why he was doing what he's doing in the way that he was doing. To me, Jayatilake's work sparkles with insight in every paragraph, and that there is something to be found and something to be learned in almost every paragraph and every line. Of course, in such a substantial and dense book, we're only going to be able to scratch the surface here in this course. And so it's very much by way of an introduction. Some of you may have attended the course on the Visuddhimagga that I did, I think, last year with Buddhist Library. And this will be a similar kind of approach to that. So we'll be looking at the background and context. We'll be looking at some of the overall concerns and approaches that's used in the book, and we'll be looking at a fairly small number of specifics in some detail. And hopefully this will be an encouragement for people to be able to read it more. If you want to get a copy, there are PDFs of it available on the web. And also, hopefully you've seen the course outline. So I've made a brief course outline, which is available, which will give you the reading for each week. And I don't know, we're in lockdown, I guess, so got plenty of time to do some reading. So that's nice, I think. All right, so let us begin with the first set of readings, which are on the first 3 chapters, which is mainly dealing with the historical background. And I'll begin with the first sentence. When we consider the history of thought in Greece. So that's the first half of the first sentence. And so I'm going to now start with giving a commentary on that. And that might take the rest of the session, but we'll see how we go, because we have to first of all consider the history of thought in Greece, and then the rest of the history of thought. So anyway, let's try doing that. The title of the book is The Early Buddhist Theory of Knowledge. This title is perhaps a little bit misleading in the sense that it is, the Buddha did not propound a theory of knowledge in the sense that he didn't sort of sit down and write a book which encapsulated all of his ideas about how to know things. On the contrary, what the Buddha did was that he presented methods and ways of different kinds and different manners in different places that were ways of being able to learn things, being able to know things. And so what Jayatilake is doing here is kind of abstracting those teachings on how to know things and formulating or putting that within the context of a coherent theory. The Buddha's approach to knowledge, and just very, just to give a very brief summary, if you don't want to bother by the rest of the course, right? You just want to the first introduction, then very briefly, the Buddha's approach to knowledge as characterized by Jayatilake is empirical, in the sense that it remains close to sense experience. And it is based on a process that is always balanced, moderate, and reasonable. And that balanced, moderate, and reasonable approach begins by approaching a teacher, approaching somebody who is an expert, somebody who knows what they're talking about, listening to what they say, taking the time and the trouble to memorize it, to reflect on it, to critically inquire into it, to apply that to one's own experience, so to put it to the test and to verify that within one's own experience. And the proof of the pudding is, does it taste good? Does the pudding taste good? Yeah, that's the proof. So there's no one pudding recipe which is going to be the right pudding recipe, to pursue a metaphor in possibly unwise detail, but there's no one right pudding recipe, but there are a lot of wrong pudding recipes that taste bad. So the same thing with the way of knowing. There's not necessarily one right way of knowing, but there's a lot of wrong ways of knowing. And so the Buddha tried, in this approach to knowing, the Buddha tried to steer his path free of various kinds of extremes in knowing. And many of those kinds of extremes in knowing are things that you may be familiar with today, such as nihilism. We can't know anything. Extremes of doubt. We don't know what's it, what's that, and we can't answer anything. Or pure subjectivism, that my opinion is just as good as your opinion. My ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Or dogmatism. I read it in such and such a book, therefore it must be true. Such and such is what I believe, therefore it must be real. And so on. And so there are various ways of knowing things that the Buddha talks about. And he talks about them in a way that are refreshingly relatable and modern. And so to me, this gives a hint as to the importance of this particular teaching, particular approach. The Buddha himself is the awakened one, the past participle of bodhayati, to awaken, to know. So the Buddha is the one who has known. And the very existence of the Buddha and the very existence of the Buddha's teachings is an act of faith in the capacity of humanity to know. This is the core of the Buddha's teachings. We can know. We can know. And so it is a repudiation of any form of radical skepticism or nihilism, which denies that it's possible to know. And it's also a repudiation of any doctrine which relies purely on a transmission of accepted knowledge. So this is a bit of a background as to the early Buddhist theory of knowledge, which Jayatilake then pursued in a lot of detail. And I said that this is, the concerns and ideas here are refreshingly modern, which is true, but it's also true that the ways that these are worked out are very culturally embedded and historically embedded. So the Buddha is not speaking to the kinds of people that you and I are most likely to speak, but he is speaking to the kinds of people who are around him at that time in his day. And often one of the fallacies of people trying to understand early Buddhism is that they start by understanding early Buddhism. And you think that you can look at what the Buddha said, and it's like, as I said in the course outline, it's like listening to a phone call where you're only listening to one side and you have no idea who they're speaking to and why they're talking in that way to that other person on the other end. And as long as you have no idea what the context is that the Buddha was speaking in, you will always misinterpret so many things that the Buddha was saying. Now, so this is why Jayatilake is beginning with the historical context. In doing so, he begins his argument with a rhetorical sleight of hand by invoking ancient Greece. Now, why? Why would you do that? Like, what's ancient Greece got to do with anything? Right? The Buddha didn't live in ancient Greece, and they didn't know anything about Socrates and Plato and those guys. Well, obviously, Jayatilake is writing within a European philosophical tradition in which he was educated, and he is speaking simultaneously to an audience of Western educated philosophers and to Buddhists, primarily in his day, it would have been primarily educated Sri Lankan Buddhists. And so he's kind of steering his path between those two things. It remains, I think, unfortunately, the case. And I know there are some philosophy students on this course, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but it remains the case that modern courses on philosophy still take European philosophy as the default. And anything other than European philosophy is still very much kind of minority, and it's seen as it's compared to European philosophy. So Jayatilake here is, whether fortunately or not, but he is following that kind of approach. Very briefly, allow me to recap the epistemological history in which Jayatilake is responding, and allow me, as we go, to define a few terms that we are going to be using along the way. So the first thing that I've mentioned a few times is the term epistemology. And if you're not familiar with it, epistemology essentially means the philosophical study of the means of knowing. How do we know what is right and what is wrong? How do we know what is true and what is false? And this is one of the major branches of philosophy of all kinds, but particularly within Buddhist philosophy. Epistemology became the single greatest school of Buddhist, certainly of Buddhist philosophy, and probably of Indian philosophy all told. That's a very subjective assessment. While Jayatilake in this book does not discuss later Indian epistemological philosophy in any detail, his student, David Kalapahana, did. And he later wrote in some of his books extensively about some of the medieval Indian epistemologists, such as Dignaga and others, and showed or argued that they were that their philosophy, that the philosophy of the later Indian epistemological philosophers drew closely and explained the details that were found in the teachings found in the early Buddhist texts. Now, in ancient Greece, the most, again, this is very, very oversimplified. So please I just want to sort of tell a bit of a just so story to frame the narrative a little bit. So please forgive me for all of the necessary omissions and generalizations and oversimplifications. But in ancient Greece, the dominant philosopher and most influential philosopher was, for the history of philosophy, was Socrates. And Socrates was a kind of philosopher known as a rationalist. And his basic idea was that we can arrive at the truth through a process of pure reason. So what did he mean by this? Well, what he meant was that consider, I'll just give you an example. Consider a sum, 2 plus 2. Okay, so what's 2 plus 2? 2 plus 2 equals, carry the third, divide equals 4, is that right? We good? 2 plus 2 equals 4. And we can all, let's say we can all agree with that, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, I learned that when I was at school, and presumably it remains the same today, right? Anyone been to school recently? A number of you went to school in different countries. I'm sure some of you maybe went to school in Vietnam or in Sri Lanka or in America or something like that. And did they also teach you that 2 plus 2 equals 4 over there? Hopefully they did, okay? Given the state of education these days, I'm not sure what kids are learning, but presumably they're still learning 2 + 2 = 4. Fine. And Socrates' point was that we can know this with absolute clarity and confidence. And in a way, that knowledge is an eternal truth. It always has been true. It's a universal truth. It's true in a deeper way than a merely empirical truth. And Socrates believed that this kind of statement pointed to a realm of deeper reality. His word of ideal forms or ideas. So there was a more real reality to which these abstract truths were pointing. Whereas if we have, let's say I have a basket and I have 2 oranges in that basket, I put another 2 oranges in the basket. How many oranges do I have? I'm gonna go out on a limb and say 4. Okay, so we know that. But as an empirical truth, it's perhaps a little bit less confident. I mean, maybe one of them is a mandarin that just looks like an orange. Okay, I mean, your senses deceive you all the time. Yeah, maybe there's a hidden compartment in the basket where there's another orange which is hidden away that I didn't see. Empirical truths are always subject to this kind of uncertainty. And if you think those examples are improbable, considered, if we make it a little bit more complicated, imagine you have a box with 2 kilos of oranges in it. And then I add another 2 kilos of oranges. How confident am I of that? I mean, you can never really have 2 kilograms of oranges. It's always approximate. It's a bit more, a bit less. And yet we use this all the time, even though there's actually no such thing as 2 kilograms of oranges. So that the realities that we point to in the world are of necessity approximate, statistical, unreliable, and subject to the many kinds of distortions of both sense activity and of cognition. And hence, to arrive at true truth, a real truth, then we have to rely on an inner process of reasoning. This is how Socrates worked, and that way of thinking dominated Western philosophy up to the time of Descartes, who many of you will know through I think, therefore I am, and Descartes, following in that tradition, attempted to derive all of philosophy from that one insight. Okay, so after Descartes in European philosophy, that approach became more and more criticized by and became gradually supplanted by an approach known as empiricism, and led by figures like Immanuel Kant or David Hume. The empirical approach pointed to many of the problems with the rationalist approach. And one of the basic problems with the rationalist approach is that these abstract ideas of numbers that we have aren't really real in the way that Socrates thought that they were. Actually, these are just generalizations. These are just abstractions. The number 2 is a concept which we have inferred from the reality of seeing 2 things. So these ideas are dependent in the process of human cognition, depend on sense experience. They don't exist before sense experience does. And the only reason we have certainty about them is because they are certain by self-definition. We've defined the numbers in such a way that they work in such a way that they get to that result. And so in making these kinds of truth claims about the process of pure reason, all we are really doing is running around in circles, biting our own tail. We're not actually saying anything real and true about the world. Now, this philosophical difference had been there since the earliest times, and many different philosophers had different takes on it. What really made the difference and what really drove the philosophy was not the philosophy itself. And this is a sort of recurring theme in philosophy. But what really drove it was the changes in society, and specifically the changes in science. Science came along and that changed everything. Newton came along and that changed everything. And Newton and Galileo and all of the others, down to Einstein and the moderns, completely changed the whole way that we think about everything and the whole way that our society works. And science, especially the physics of Newton, was so spectacularly successful. Newton was just unbelievably successful at doing what he did. He painted this picture of the world that was so powerful and so precise in so many ways. And we know that it was successful. Why? Because we can build steam engines, because it actually matters. And all of the works of all of the philosophers just kind of sit there and philosophers discuss about them and what difference does it make? And when they did the physics and they started pointing out how powerful science was, suddenly you had trains and you had factories, and soon afterwards you had cars and planes, and you had telegraph, and you had electric lights. And the overwhelming power of this method, the scientific method, was the most fantastic demonstration of its, I guess, truth, or at very least of its efficacy. And scientific method is based on empirical observation. And this is one of the innovations that was brought about originally by people like, say, Galileo, who tested the earlier theories of physics. And so we can put them to the test. The theories of physics say that gravity works in this way. Let's put it to the test. And he found that gravity didn't, in fact, work in that way at all. And so the wisdom of the ancients was gradually thrown out, and a new kind of understanding was built based on empiricism, based on observation and inference from observation. And one of the things that these empiricists found was that, yes, it is true to say that such knowledge is approximate. That's true. Socrates' critique was a perfectly valid one. It's an approximate kind of knowledge. It's never precise. It's statistical. But it's good enough. And that's the point that Socrates missed out. It's good enough. And in fact, the interesting detail is that a slightly less precise kind of knowledge is actually much more effective. A slightly less kind of precise kind of knowledge is much more effective. And so we began used to the idea of measuring more and more precisely, while accepting that measurements must be, to some extent, imprecise in the real world. So the theories of empiricist philosophy began to dominate in Europe, and the philosophical mind became so transfixed by this success that it became commonplace in perhaps the 19th century and so on to think that we would reach an end of knowledge, that we would figure everything out, that we could make a one theory to rule them all. And there were several attempts to do such a thing. Who was it? Bertrand Russell did his, I can't remember what it's called, Principia Mathematica, if I remember correctly, and various others made these kinds of attempts to put knowledge onto this secure footing that would encapsulate once and for all knowledge in a grounded way that would be, yes, empirically based, but also have a degree of confidence and certainty to it. And this group, that kind of movement, became known as the Positivist Movement. Then around the middle of the 20th century, then a huge change came about. And it's a change in the attitude of Western philosophy, which I think is the most important philosophical shift in modern times. A number of people and a number of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century, from a number of different perspectives, started to say that actually, no, knowledge is absolute knowledge and perfect knowledge is impossible. Famously, Heisenberg propounded his uncertainty theory in the field of quantum physics. It's not possible to know the velocity and the position of a particle at the same time. It's not merely that we don't have the instruments to measure it accurately enough. It's fundamentally impossible to know both of these two things at the same time. There are limits to what is knowable. And even, he posited, the very act of knowing would change the thing that is known. And various other people came up with similar kinds of ideas. Gödel, the great mid-20th century mathematician, proved that there was no mathematical treatise that could be fully self-defined and fully self-consistent. Alan Turing, the father of the computer, one of his great insights was known as the halting problem. The halting problem declares that if you need to solve a problem with a computer, the computer program can't know when it begins if it's ever going to stop. All right, just think about that for a minute. If you're going to solve a mathematical problem, okay, when you begin solving it, you don't know if you're going to ever finish solving it. But what you do know is that you're going to get bored eventually. And if you can't solve it, you're going to give up. But computers don't get bored. So this is the halting problem, and it's kind of one of the major insights that underlies the development of computer programs as we have them today. So these are from a number of different angles, all pointing to a similar kind of thing, that there are limits to what is known. Now, even though the empirical method has proven itself to be so incredibly effective, there are still limits to what is known. Now, we've now caught up with Jayatilake, who studied under the great Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein himself was caught right in the middle of that crisis. And Wittgenstein's early work was built very much on the idea of constructing a solid foundation and overall overarching theory of knowledge, a project that he later dismissed, and in the later part of his life embarked on a much more enigmatic and harder to pin down project of reflection that eschewed any sort of overarching theory that was going to encapsulate everything. Jayatilake was Wittgenstein's student, and what he's doing is he's taking this knowledge and learning that he's gained from Wittgenstein and applying it in the context of the study of early Buddhism. All right. Now, that, if you like, dismantling of monolithic knowledge in the mid-20th century has had huge effects. It was one of the underlying insights behind the development of postmodernism a couple of decades later. And postmodernism argued against the existence of one overarching authoritative narrative. And the postmodernists pointed out that the people who are propounding an authoritative narrative of the truth claim to rest that authority on epistemology. They claim that we are propounding this truth because we have access to the actual reality of the world as it is. And yet, if we look more closely, we can see that what underlies that is often power. The reason that certain people's version of the truth prevails is because they sit in the chair. That's why my version of the truth is prevailing here, because I'm the one who gets to be invited to speak. So you all get to listen to my version of the truth. And so, and obviously there's some truth to that, okay? And the postmodernists pointed out that by doing so, you marginalize the voices of the dispossessed, women's voices, voices of people of color, voices of people in the margins, voices of people who are impoverished, and so on. And again, obviously there's a lot of truth to that. And, you know, I'm personally very happy that we live in a world where, at least to some extent, we can begin to hear those other stories and to enrich our human experience by not restricting our knowledge to the gatekeepers of the authorities. At the same time, though, that kind of approach leads to a destabilizing of knowledge. And destabilizing knowledge in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, because that's what helps innovation and progress. However, what we've seen in recent decades is that that process has become amplified and accelerated through the internet, through social media, and it's also become weaponized when people have begun to realize that the rhetoric of postmodernism, the rhetoric of do the research, find out for yourself, there's more than one truth. This has now migrated from the philosophers and the dilettantes to Twitter and YouTube, and it's led to a wholesale deconstruction of a kind of shared reality. I'm going to wrap up this very brief history of epistemology with a tweet. And so it's a tweet that I happened to come across yesterday, and the tweet was I'm not going to something like, "Why do dogs love us so much?" Why? It's a good question, right? Why do dogs love us so much? I don't know. Are we worthy of their love? It seems hard to say, but their love is so pure and so devoted that why do we deserve this? And it's a beautiful question because it's an open-ended question, and it's looking at something which is important, like what is the nature of love? Like is love just restricted to human beings? What about across other species? And it's a tweet that looks to inquiring and to understanding. It's a tweet that on the face of it is full of curiosity and gratitude. It's nice. Unfortunately, when I read that tweet, I thought it was a nice tweet, so I clicked through to that tweeter's profile, and it wasn't long before I got to gravity isn't real. Just in case you didn't know, gravity isn't real. Obviously, COVID isn't real. The COVID injections are the mark of the beast, if you didn't know. And one that I didn't even know, and I was really kind of shocked about, is that Afghanistan didn't happen. Like all that stuff you've seen on the news, the planes taking off, the scenes in Kabul, all that is just a false flag operation. All of those photographs of the refugees on the planes, everything, that's all Photoshop. None of that happened, okay? And I was kind of impressed at the speed with which they could put together a comprehensive conspiracy theory in a couple of days, complete with all of the demonstrations and graphics and proofs and so on. And so how do we get here? Seriously. I mean, here's a person who wonders about why dogs love us so much. I mean, she sounds like a lovely person. And you'd meet her in the park. Well, you wouldn't meet her in the park because we're in Sydney and you'd be arrested, but you would, probably going to have to explain for people like in the old days, you used to be able to meet people in real life. Yes, it was actually a thing. And how can it be? And look, I'm sure you all know about this, and I'm sure you've all got family and friends, colleagues, acquaintances who have been down one or other, or perhaps many of these rabbit holes of climate change denialism, QAnon, COVID denialism, and all of these kinds of things. And it's kind of scary. And it's kind of crazy, right? It's crazy. You look at that, this is mad. And one of my favorite commentators in the last few years is Dr. Bandy X. Lee, who was a Yale clinical psychiatrist. And she was co-author of the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald, it was The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump? Anyway, one of those books. Part of a group of senior psychiatrists who talked about mental illness. They dared to talk about mental illness in a public sphere. and talked about the danger of electing a psychotic person as the president, and how this infects society and it spreads a psychosis throughout society. So this is a mental illness which is infecting our society. It's not a metaphor. Like, it's genuinely crazy and it's really dangerous. Yeah. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the last time that this happened in Western societies was in Germany in the 1930s. And we're heading down a very dangerous path. And so it's really important for us to ground ourselves back in the known, to remind ourselves of what is real, to remember that, look, part of us is how do we relate to people who've gone down these different rabbit holes and who've disappeared in these ways and who have become so disconnected? How do you actually, how do you live in the same world as people who are like that? That's a genuine concern. But my concern is actually a little bit more basic than that, because there is probably not a single person on this class who has not at least dabbled in some kind of kooky ideas. I know I have. And there's a difference between dabbling and like genuinely believing that birds aren't real. And which, by the way, is another thing. If you're not aware of it, you can Google birds aren't real. I'm not sure how serious the birds aren't real people are. This is part of who we are. And actually, one of the problems is that this kind of conspiracy thinking, this kind of wild, paranoid, nonsensical, imaginative thinking, detached from reality and so on, actually is kind of fun. And a lot of it, and being able to think outside the box, is what's fueled so much great art, so much great philosophy, and so on. Right? And we can't have that fun anymore. They took it away from us. And to be able to play with crazy ideas is part of being a human being. It's part of where creativity comes from. And yet we are in a world where it's so easy to get caught up in these things and to get lost. And the Buddha always urged us to be peaceful among the violent, to be wise among the foolish. Yeah. And this is the world that we're in. We're in a world where we are surrounded by people who are becoming detached from reality. And this is being, of course, accelerated in the COVID time, where we are spending so much time in isolation, and social interactions are not, social interactions that might ease these things and wear them down, these have been taken away from us. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to teach this course on Jayatilake. And Jayatilake brings us back to those fundamental teachings, and he shows us the different kinds of approaches to knowing why they are important, why they matter, and what kinds of pitfalls that we can fall into. All right, so this is my bit of a commentary so far. So far I've given a bit of a comment on, thank you for birds are real, Akalika. This is my bit of a comment on the first half of the first sentence in Jayatilake's book. Okay, good. So I'm just going to have a little bit of a break here and just go through the quotes. Birds aren't real, and likes birds. That's nice. I'm glad of that. Postmodernism is the cause of anti-vax. Postmodernism is definitely one of the underlying steps in that direction, for sure. Yeah. I mean, in the field of Buddhist studies, I've been painfully aware for many years of the very damaging effects of postmodern philosophy on Buddhist studies. And in my belief, the effect of postmodernism on Buddhist studies, especially in America, has been to hold up the field for a generation, especially because of the work of the scholar Gregory Chopin. And Gregory Chopin's essential idea is we do not know. It's like a refrain which is repeated again and again through his work. We don't know this, we don't know that. And so rather than scholarship as a quest to clarify and expand knowledge, he sees scholarship as a way of undermining knowledge and creating disknowledge or unknowledge, and a way of almost dismissing any claims to knowledge. And his approach has been very influential in especially American Buddhist studies, and his critiques of early Buddhism have been roundly dismissed by the actual scholars of early Buddhism, of which he is not one. And yet it's still, to this day, almost very few people in academic studies in America are actually teaching American Buddhism. So actually teaching early Buddhism in any form. And I know it's really hard for people to sort of get their head around this. But if you monitor the American Academy of Religions conferences, the largest interfaith conference in America, they have each year maybe 80 papers presented on Buddhism. And I check those up usually each year. And usually each year there are precisely 0 papers on the suttas, on the Vinaya, on the Buddha, on the Buddha's teachings, on anything that happened in the early tradition, on King Ashoka, the early spread of Buddhism, or anything that happened in the first 500 years of Buddhism. Nothing. There might be maybe 2 or 3 papers at most dealing tangentially with minor issues. And that's it. That's what people are learning. So we've simply erased the actual basis of Buddha's teachings from Buddhist studies. And so, yes, I think that this, and to do this, Gregory Chopin himself falls into a lot of the kind of conspiratorial thinking, like sort of darkly hinting at conspiracies among monks to suppress different kinds of knowledge and these kinds of things that Chopin falls into. So, I mean, I think Chopin has made some genuine contributions in discussions of middle and later period Buddhism, but I think that, yes, that this postmodernism, anyway, my experience in my field in Buddhist studies has had a very, very harmful effect. And I do believe that has contributed in a major way to the destabilization of knowledge that we're seeing more generally in society today. Okay, so that's so far been a rather dense introduction on the first line of Jayatilake. How about we have some meditation? Would you like to do that? Yes. Let's have like just a 5-minute silent meditation. We can have a bit of a break. And continuing with Jayatilake's opening paragraph, or opening sentence, really. When we consider the history of thought in Greece, we find that metaphysics first develops out of mythology, And it is only when metaphysical speculation attains a certain maturity and results in the formulation of a variety of theories that an interest is shown in the problem of knowledge and epistemological questions are first mooted. If we turn to the Indian context, we can trace an analogous, though by no means an identical, development. So here, Jayatilake is, in a way, he's speaking to an audience who are educated in the history of European philosophy, and bringing them on board with an analogy that they would understand. And this is the things that he's talking about here would be well known to any philosopher. That if you look in Greek writings, you start with Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and so on. And philosophical speculations tended to grow out of that. And the questions of epistemology begin to arise when we begin to ask questions like, how do we know if the gods are real? Or how, if such and such a philosopher teaches that the origin of all things is in water, and such a philosopher teaches that the origin of things is in fire, how are we to be able to tell who is right and who is wrong? And so there begins the study of things like logic and evidence and so on. So this is a kind of process that is sort of well understood in ancient Greece, and a similar kind of thing is observed in ancient India. Jayatilake goes on, the intense speculative interest, which is so evident in the 10th book of the Rig Veda, persists as an undercurrent in the period of the Brahmanas and issues forth in the theories and intuitions of the Upanishads, whether we consider them a linear development in Vedic thought or as being due to the impact of an external element, Aryan or non-Aryan. All right, so again, he's kind of assuming a lot of knowledge here, but again, just very brief background. The Vedas are the oldest Indian literature. They are the sacred literature these days of the Hindus. It's important to note that in the time of the Buddha and those times, there was no concept of Hindu in the way that we think of it today. The Vedas were originally the secret knowledge of certain clans who preserved rituals and hymns for the specific gods of their individual clans. And in the Kuru country around modern Delhi, a few hundred years before the time of the Buddha, so perhaps 800 or 900 BC, there was a big war, which is commemorated or remembered in the Mahabharata. And as a result of that war, those peoples unified, and those books, the Vedic books, were unified into one system. The 10th book, which Jayatilake is referring to, was probably composed about that time, so about the 8th or 9th century BCE, probably in the region of the Kuru country around modern Delhi. And it's one of what is known as the unity books. And its overall purpose is to unify the disparate collections of hymns which were inherited from the different clans. So no longer do each of the clans and families have their own secret books, but now there is an overall collection which belongs to everyone from that priestly clan, i.e. the Brahmanical clan. So this Rig Veda is about 10,000 or so verses. It's very old. The oldest verses are more than 3,000 years old. Most of it is concerned with hymns and rituals and so on. But in the 10th book, the latest book, you start to find the emergence of philosophical inquiry. And so this is what Jayatilake is referring to. The Brahmanas, which he mentions there, are certain texts which explains the rituals found in the Rig Veda, and the Upanishads are the more philosophical and contemplative texts. The oldest of the Upanishads emerged shortly before the time of the Buddha. And in fact, it is Jayatilake himself who later in the book shows for the first time very convincingly that at least 4 of the Upanishads are mentioned by name in the early texts, specifically in the Tevijja Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. So the Buddhist text, early Buddhist texts refer to the Vedas very commonly, and they refer to an ancillary branches of knowledge and literature associated with the Vedas very commonly, but they don't refer to the Upanishads very much. They refer to a lot of similar ideas to the Upanishads, but not to the actual texts. And Jayatilake showed that the exception to that is in the Tevijja Sutta, where there is a reference which is unmistakably to 4 of the earliest of the Upanishads. Okay. Now, as I'm going on, Rodrigo says that it's not possible to say that Jayatilake was Wittgenstein's student. Okay, so what he's saying is that there were discussions at Cambridge that Jayatilake went to say. Okay, so that's a really interesting comment there, Rodrigo. So people, please have a look at that. And I think it's a good point to just bear in mind in general that, and I know this is certainly the case in Buddhism, that you often hear, oh, so and so was so and so's student, but actually, what does that mean to say that, right? I mean, does that just mean someone who just showed up and sat at the back of the class for a while? Maybe. And it certainly doesn't mean that someone sort of had the sort of torch handed down to them. So that's I think, a really good point there, Rodrigo. But there's certainly, I think, Wittgenstein's ideas are part of the context and learning within which Jayatilake is operating. Okay. Okay. Contemporaneous with the middle or late Upanishads, perhaps even later, we find the existence of schools of thought which either broke away from the Vedic tradition or grew up in isolation from and in opposition to it. The thought of this period displays a wide variety of views. It was probably during this period, which is coeval with or immediately prior to the rise of Jainism and Buddhism, that there first arose the first questionings about the nature, scope, and validity of knowledge, resulting in the emergence of the skeptics. So here we have one of the first technical terms, the skeptics Ajnanika, in Pali known as Amara Vikepika, and the epistemological and logical theories peculiar to materialism, Ajivikism, Jainism, and Buddhism. So again, he's talking about the historical context. And if you read the suttas, then this extremely rich, vibrant, and diverse intellectual and philosophical context is very much present within the Pali canon and the early suttas in general. The Buddha is constantly visiting different people, having discussions with different philosophers, and different people propounding many different kinds of ideas, which are not just different in content, but also very different in manner and different in means. And so Jayatilake will go on to look at some of these different schools and how they had their own individual means of knowing, and how those new schools and new ideas related to the older Vedic tradition, which very much emphasized the authority of the oral literature that has been passed down. Okay. And Jayatilake goes on, paragraph 3, when a metaphysical theory is fairly well developed, there is a tendency to inquire into the grounds of its truth. Similarly, where there are a number of conflicting theories about a particular problem, it would be natural to ask which of them was true. Both of these queries lead to an investigation of the nature and truth and knowledge, which may give rise to logical and epistemological doctrines. This seems to have been the general pattern according to which interest was first stimulated and advances made in the solution of the problem of knowledge, both in India as well as in Greece. And just to add to that, still today as well. So again, we were put into this situation where people will talk about alternative facts and this kind of idea, well, I have my truth and you have your truth. And then we start to, well, what's behind that? What is your truth? How did you learn your truth? How did I learn my truth? How do we find these things out? And they're not easy. It's not easy to solve these problems at all. All right. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit over the next couple of passages and come to the discussion of the Nasadiya hymn, Rig Veda 10.129, which is on paragraph 8 of Jayatilake. So preceding this, Jayatilake is, hang on, I think he begins that before. Jayatilake previously discusses some of the ways of knowing within the Vedas. And then this particular hymn, the Nasadiya hymn, is part of that late book, the 10th book of the Vedas, and is one of the most famous passages in the whole of the Vedic literature. I'm just seeing if there's a translation, and it ends up by saying that he who is Lord in the highest heaven, he verily knows if, hang on. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I don't want to read that out because he's presenting a couple of different translations here. I'm just trying to find the actual accepted translation. He who is Lord in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps even he does not know. So this is a question in a hymn which has arisen from a creation myth, how the world has come into being, and who can look down upon this creation and know what underlies it, what came before all of these things. Is there somebody who can tell us, some source of knowledge and authority, who can tell us what this is all about? Is there somebody that we can rely on? And so this comes back to those ideas that I was talking about earlier, about whether knowledge can be considered to be complete or not. And is there anybody who we can turn to as an unimpeachable authority as to the nature and truth of the universe and the origin of the universe? And the Rig Veda answers this in a curiously enigmatic way. Only he who sits in the highest heaven and looks down on all creation, only he knows. Or perhaps even he does not know. Now, Jayatilake discusses the kind of to's and fro's of this a little bit, goes into more detail than we need to do right now, and scholarly discussions of the exact interpretation and so on. But this is the basic idea. And that's isn't that an incredible concept to have in a religious text, right? Maybe God doesn't know. And those of us who've come from an Abrahamic background, grown up on the Bible or whatever, then the concept that anybody in the Bible would be writing, oh, well, perhaps God just didn't know what he was doing. Right? I mean, I'll be honest, it would solve a lot of theological problems. The problem of evil. How come there's evil in the world? Well, God didn't quite know what he was doing and he kind of messed up. Oh, okay, well, that explains it. It seems like a reasonable explanation, but you can't do it that way. You can't admit that kind of lack in God's knowing. So that epistemological humility, which is characteristic of that Nasadiya hymn, is something which is very influential and carried through to Buddhism. And given what I was talking about before, it presages the development of epistemological humility in the Western European tradition by 2,500 years. It took us 2,500 years to catch up with that. And I think that's a really important point for us to just kind of let that sink in, that it's okay. It's okay to not have to know everything and to not be certain about everything. It's okay. We can live with that. And to me, this is a sign of maturity. It's a sign of being an adult, to be able to live with uncertainty, to be able to know, I don't know. And the idea that somehow we can have some ancient scripture that's going to tell us everything, it's really childish. I'm sorry, it just is. And you should have grown out of that stuff when you're a teenager. And you should have realized that actually some things are certain, some things are less certain. But then, of course, the problem then becomes, how do we avoid falling into the extreme of skepticism and nihilism? If even God doesn't know, what point do I have? Yeah. So, okay. On page 27 of the book, that is paragraph number 9, Jayatilake draws out a nice little flow chart. We're giving the kind of the logical kind of flow of options. This is almost like a kind of a diagram that a computer programmer would draw to sort of lay out the logic of a program, you know, kind of if, else, then, and so on. And so he's showing what Jayatilake is pointing here is that there is, within this Nasadya hymn, there is an understanding and a sense of logic, an understanding of alternatives. Either he knows or he does not know. If he does know, then either he created it or he did not create it. If he did create it, then it began with either being or non-being. If rejecting those, there was either neither being nor non-being, then it goes to 2 questions. One question, was it water, unfathomable and deep, or he breathed without breath, without spirit? So Jayatilake sums up this. Despite the, to us, dogmatic presentation of his own theory, the skeptical conclusion, after taking account of almost all the possible answers of this question, nearly approaches skepticism with regards to the possibility of knowledge in respect of the problem of the origin of the world. This skepticism, which is based on the consideration that since the gods came after the creation, no one knows how the world began, because no one was there to behold the spectacle, is soon forgotten in the orthodox tradition. Okay, so Jayatilake is saying, and you know, whether he's true or not, is right or not is another thing, but this is also an important point, that the sacred text expresses a humility in knowing, and yet the tradition that follows that sacred text pretty much ignores that and insists on a dogmatic assertion of the truth of what is known. And of course, that kind of reification and dogmatism in traditions is the norm, and is very much the case in Buddhism as it is anywhere else. But Jayatilake does go on to mention some exceptions to that, pointing out that in the suttas, Brahma, although he's said to be the creator, is also said to be ignorant of his own creation. More significantly, Jayatilake points to the passage in the suttas where the Buddha says that it is not possible to conceive of the beginning of the world. A first cause of the world is not known. And so that skeptical stance, which is hinted at in the Nasadya hymn, is stated much more explicitly and firmly in the suttas themselves. There are limits to what we can know. And just as Western philosophy, mid-European philosophy found the same thing, it's only when we accept the limitations of knowledge that we can deepen our knowledge. This is kind of paradox. If we try to understand everything, we'll end up understanding nothing. Okay. Okay, so skipping ahead briefly to chapter 14. That's not chapter 14, paragraph 14. Jayatilake says the reasoning in the Brahmanas is analogical and centers around the symbolism of the sacrifice. The analogies are remote. A fanciful etymology, a myth, a legend, or a vague similarity is sufficient to establish a connection between two things. An explanation to be satisfactory has to be made in terms of sacrificial analogy. And he then goes on to give a number of examples of this. So the point here that Jayatilake is expanding on the proposition from the original paragraph that the development of epistemology and logic draws from mythology, and that this is the same both, or follows a similar path in both Greece and India. One of the things which I think Jayatilake does not explore, and which I think is the limitation of his method, is that he tends to elide the quality of mythology and mythological understanding as a means of understanding in and of itself. So you're seeing mythological understanding as a stepping stone towards a more rational and scientific understanding, which, historically, there's obviously some truth to that. But mythological understanding has its own integrity and its own meaning, which is not reducible to its mere being a stepping stone to other forms of knowledge. But one of the things that he is pointing to here with the idea of analogical understanding is the idea that something happens in the sacrifice that is similar to something that happens somewhere else. And this you find all the way through the Upanishads. The Brihararanika Upanishad begins with a set of analogies for the horse sacrifice. And so each part of the horse which is sacrificed is related in some way to the world. So when the horse urinates, for example, that's like when it rains, and so on and so forth. And these analogies are very fanciful, as Jayatilake points out. So on the one hand, from a rational point of view, you can say, well, this is not a particularly promising path to actually finding out the truth of things by assuming that the kind of fairly much arbitrary details of a particular ancient ritual are going to map closely to the details of how the world is. So from a rational point of view, this kind of logic is fairly easy to dismiss. At the same time, though, how these things are understood is in terms of sandhi. Sandhi, a Sanskrit or Pali word meaning connection. And the idea of sandhi is that there's almost like these kind of invisible webs, almost like these kind of tendrils of connection between those things that we do in a ritual sacrifice and the world and the cosmos as a whole. And what that means is that we, the people who are taking part in that ritual, find meaning through that ritual and find connection with the world as a whole. And so the point of this kind of thing is not to establish an objective truth in the sense that we might look for a scientific truth. The point of it is to make life meaningful, to perform an act that will place oneself and one's own place in the world in a meaningful way, that will give value to your life. And that's not something which can be reduced to rationality. And so I think, we're going to be focused on the rational here. And I'm not advocating going out and doing sacrifices, okay? Just FYI, right? I'm not advocating for that at all. But I am saying that if we want to understand these things, we have to be empathetic to the people who are doing them. It wasn't merely that they were trying to do science, but they were too stupid to do it properly. They were doing something else. And that something else that they were doing was meaningful to them. And to them, it was an important dimension of their humanity. So, to my mind, philosophical understanding or true understanding has to proceed with empathy. Not to say we forget our critical mind, but we have to begin with an empathy and a connection. Otherwise, we'll never really understand where people are coming from. Okay, so this is the Vedic and the Upanishadic tradition, and the so Jayatilake goes on to show how in the Upanishads we have the emergence of a more kind of rational and inquiry-based approach to knowledge, rather than merely the passing down of knowledge from the Vedas. Okay, and I'm going to Sorry, just going to go to keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to skip ahead here to the teachings of, sorry, I wanted to look at a few different things, but I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll just have to shorten it a little bit. All right, so we'll skip ahead to paragraph number 41, and we'll consider briefly the philosophy of Yajnavalkya. And those of you who have attended many of my talks will know that I refer to Yajnavalkya fairly frequently, and I regard him as being the most important precursor of the Buddha in terms of Indian philosophy. And the teachings of Yajnavalkya are found within the oldest, largest, and most interesting of the Upanishads, which is the Brihararanika Upanishad. And I would highly recommend that if you're interested in any of these things, please do have a read of that. It's an eminently readable work. It's somewhat chaotic and messy. Some parts of it are weird, and some parts of it are kind of twisted, but many of it are quite beautiful and quite inspiring and even quite funny. The Brihararanika is like a compilation. It's not a coherent work. It's like different chapters from different places. So the different parts of it can be quite different. You can find translations of it on the Sacred Text Archive and probably elsewhere as well. So Yajnavalkya lived in India maybe a couple of hundred years before the Buddha, and in the same region of India that the Buddha lived in. And in fact, we find in the stories he was visiting some of the same towns and places that the Buddha went to. So he was very much part of the cultural milieu not long before the Buddha. And there may even be, we don't know the exact dates, so there may even have been people alive who were the students of Yajnavalkya or the students of Yajnavalkya. And interestingly enough, it's a bit of a side, but the oldest Brahmin mentioned in the suttas is Brahmayu, who's said to be 100 years old, and he comes from the same area as Yajnavalkya did. So it's possible that Yajnavalkya might have even known or taught Brahmayu. That's very speculative. Anyway, according to Jayatilake, Yajnavalkya's importance for us lies in the fact that he too is a rationalist thinker who popularized a double negative form of expression used in the Buddhist texts. His theory of survival also seems to be known to Buddhism. So that idea of the double negative, okay, a way of knowing things through negation, which we find quite commonly in the suttas. The Buddha was quite a negative thinker, as he's been characterized. It's not this, it's not that, it's not this, it's not that, and not that. And he's always, that's an important part of his rhetorical arsenal. And in fact, for the Buddha, the denial of ontological status was key to his depiction of Nibbana. And I think that his understanding was that as soon as we start talking about the ontological reality, ontology being the philosophy of being rather than epistemology, the philosophy of knowing, as soon as we start talking about the ontology of Nibbana in a positive way, then people are going to get attached, and delusion's going to get stepped in, and it's all going to get very messy very quickly. So he would always, the idea of not, in a way, the negatives that the Buddha used has a clearing sense in the mind, that he's turning you away from the consideration of certain kinds of things and turning you towards the consideration of other kinds of things. And that mode, that rhetorical mode, is first found in Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya has been called a mystic by Rubin, but this is misleading since there's no reason to believe that Yajnavalkya's theories are based on any kind of mystical experience, as were the views of most of the thinkers of the middle and late Upanishads. That's a kind of a debatable point, and I'm not entirely convinced. it's true to say that there's no explicit description of meditation within the philosophy of Yajnavalkya, but when I read Yajnavalkya's philosophy, it sounds meditative to me. It sounds like a contemplative teaching. It sounds like the kind of thing that a meditator would say. So I tend to more think that there was a meditative culture underlying Yajnavalkya's philosophy, but I admit that I can't really prove it. Besides, another fact that has not been considered in the treatment of Yajnavalkya is that the teachings ascribed to him in different places in the Upanishads do not seem to be of a piece or consistent with each other. For instance, on the one hand, so again, I just sort of note in passing how Jayatilake he's a critical philosopher. He's not just here to expound to you the Upanishadic philosophy as if it's some kind of monolithic thing that you can then know and everything's the same as everything and all of this kind of stuff. He's a critical philosopher and he wants to make distinctions. He wants to point out that just as perhaps with Wittgenstein, that not all of Wittgenstein's works agree, not all of Yajnavalkya's works agree, and that's kind of okay. Whereas the traditional approach is very much to harmonize and explain away difference. We find that, of course, very much within the Buddhist tradition as well, where the traditional position is always that, the teachings in the suttas, the teachings in the commentaries, the teaching of later texts, and down to the teachings given by my teacher to me, these are all the same. Obviously, that's just not true, right? Things just don't stay the same for 2,500 years. And we have to interrogate that and question that. And that's part of the path towards knowledge. And to say that they're different doesn't mean to say that they're wrong or to say that there's even any problem. Sometimes there are good reasons why things are different. Anyway, for instance, on the one hand, the Neti doctrine, or the transcendent conception of Brahman, who is described only in terms of negative epithets, is attributed to him. And on the other hand, the pantheistic doctrine totally opposed to it, to the effect that Brahman is made of this, made of that. The problem explanation for this is that several incompatible doctrines were put into the mouth of an outstanding teacher. Possibly, that's one explanation. It's also possible that Yajnavalkya changed his mind. It's also possible that actually these things are not really contradictory, but they're actually just different ways of looking at the same thing, and that at a deeper level of understanding that they would be harmonized. Anyway, I'm not going to resolve all of these differences, but we'll just have a look at the Neti doctrine. So Neti means not that, not that. And the basic idea is that Yajnavalkya is saying that whatever you think is yourself, not that. And I take this to be myself, not that. I'm attached to this, not that. And is it your cows? That's what I think myself is. I'm my cows. I identify my cows. I'm a 5 cow owner person, so I'm better than you, right? Not that. Do we identify with our house, with our clothes, with our caste, with our clan, with our skin color, with our gender? Do we identify with our education? Do we identify with our feelings? Do we identify with our thoughts? Do we identify with our perceptions, our memories? Not that. And that Neti teaching of Yajnavalkya is like a knife that's cutting away the misidentification of the self. And clearly in this, we have an extremely important precursor to the Buddhist idea of not self. Now, of course, Yajnavalkya didn't say that there was no self. Right? What he wanted to do was to get people to not misconceive the self by getting attached to things that were not the true self. Once you've done Neti, got rid of everything, then what's left is the self, which for Yajnavalkya was the consciousness, Vijnanagana. So here that negative mode, that critical mode of slicing off and getting to what matters, This is one of the approaches that we find within the philosophy of Yajnavalkya, which became an important part of the Brahmanical tradition as a whole. Okay. Okay, so I'll just read through the passage by Jayatilake on this. We shall confine ourselves to Yajnavalkya on the Neti doctrine and consider the passages ascribed to him in various sections of the Upanishad. Deussen, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Deussen quite rightly traces the primitive source of the entire conception of the unknowables of the Atman to the statements ascribed to Yajnavalkya in this Upanishad. But it is equally necessary to emphasize the fact that the rational unknowability of the Atman is rationally arrived at and is not a product of mystical experience. In fact, Deussen himself points this out when examining the classical text of this. He says, on careful consideration, two thoughts will be found to implied here. One, the supreme Atman is unknowable because he is the all-comprehending unity, whereas all knowledge presupposes a duality of subject and object. But also, two, the individual Atman is also unknowable because in all knowledge, he is the knowing subject and consequently can never be the object. We agree with Deussen that the two arguments are implicit in this passage. First, that since reality is one and knowledge is dual, we cannot have knowledge of reality. And second, that the subject of knowledge cannot be known because it is never the object, and thou canst not know the knower of knowing, as he translates. This is reasoning and not mystic experience. Again, I would question that characterization of that last one, but the basic point still stands. This idea that we find commonly in Yajnavalkya, who is to know that which knows all things? The unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, the unknown knower. And so elsewhere in the Upanishads, you also find this another sort of search in a similar kind of way. We want to find who is the self, and then we get a fruit. We peel the fruit. And then what's there? Is that the self? No. Then we take off the flesh of the fruit. What is there? Is that the self? No. We have the seed. Is that the self? No. We can take off the husk of the seed. Is that yourself? No. If we take off the husk and we leave just the kernel, is the kernel of the seed, is that yourself? No. If we break open the kernel of the seed and there's nothing there, is that yourself? Ah, there you finally arrived at the self. So this is this kind of idea of a quest for knowledge. And how different is this quest for knowledge from the idea of a religious tradition per se? Remember that when the Buddha first taught his first sermon, Pubbe ananusute sudhamesu, regarding things not learnt before from another. That was his great insight, the insight of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. These are things that I knew for myself, my insight. I found them out, not learned before from another. And that idea that truth is something that we find for ourselves is inherent in the Buddhist tradition. It's absolutely fundamental. And yet, of course, it's constantly displaced in the Buddhist tradition because instead of saying it's something I true for myself, we say, oh, it's something that's found in the suttas. That's where truth comes from. And this is problematic, right? This is the field that we deal with. So in the Upanishadic tradition, it's a similar kind of thing. So on the one hand, it's a process of handing down the knowledge of the Vedas, reciting them, and merely like getting the syllables right, like mechanically reproducing the sounds and doing that generation after generation. That's knowledge. And the Upanishads, as you can see, was really challenging that by pointing to a sort of knowledge as a sense of inquiry that is going to go deeper and deeper and deeper to find who you truly are, who is your true self. And all of those things which you are deluded about, that you mistake to be yourself, then you find that the real self is something else, something much more subtle, which sits at the heart of all of those things. And so in this way, we can see that this Upanishadic tradition, while on the one hand claiming to be the inheritor of the Vedic tradition, at the same time is also a radical and skeptical tradition of inquiry. All right, I am going to then skip over the rest of the discussion of the Vedic texts. And there's a lot of really interesting things there, both in terms of like the specific details as well as the sort of general principles. It's one of the kind of the richest passages in the Vedas. I'll just mention one or two other details which I think are important lessons that I learned from Jayatilake. One which actually I already just hinted at a minute ago. I talked about the Upanishadic phrase. It talked about the unseen seer, the unheard hearer, the unthought thinker, the unknown knower. And this relates to, if you see passage, paragraph number 70 in Jayatilake's first chapter, he analyzes the relationship between those phrases and similar phrases found in the suttas. Or in fact, there he gives the list of found in the Upanishads, but we find then in the next passage, 72, he's talking about the corresponding passages in the suttas. And there is no doubt that those passages in the suttas do in fact relate to those passages in the Upanishads, not least because these passages are characteristically taught to Brahmins in a Brahmanical context, in places like, say, the Solasapanya of the Parayana Vagga in the Sutta Nipata. So the Buddha referred to what is seen, what is heard, what is thought, and what is cognized. Now, what Jayatilake points out here is that these are means of knowing spiritual truths, and that they have been rather systematically misinterpreted by the Buddhist tradition as being mere sensory inputs. So what the Abhidhamma does is the Abhidhamma says seeing, okay, we know what seeing is, hearing is fine. This one, mutta, which means thought, is what's smelled, taste, and touch. And vinyata is cognized by the mind. So this four, seen, heard, thought, and cognized, is then mapped onto the six senses. Sorry, I don't have six fingers here, but I think you get the idea. And from the Abhidhamma period onwards, and you even find this in the later passages in the Vinaya, then that kind of understanding of what these things is really talking about is lost. And this is one of the things that we find within the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha was talking to Brahmins, and he was using ideas and concepts with which they were familiar. But later generations of Buddhists only spoke with other Buddhists, it seems, and they didn't understand a lot of these Brahmanical ideas, and they systematically misinterpreted a lot of these things. So this is one of the reasons why this kind of historical inquiry that Jayatilake is using is so important. So the word mutta in that group of four is from the word manyati. It means to think. I mean, it's a very common, very basic word in Pali, to think. And it obviously means to think. It obviously doesn't mean sensed. And if you look at most modern translations, including even the translations of Bhikkhu Bodhi, they will still say seen, heard, sensed, and cognized. And that's influenced by this Abhidhamma interpretation. So, but what this means is that these are four ways of learning about religious truths, spiritual truths, through seeing, through dasana. Right? So through dasana is like samana dasana. You see the truth like through physical eyes. We're not talking about spiritual insight here. That like the Bodhisattva who went out from his home, who saw an ascetic or a monk and who decided to follow that path. So through seeing, through hearing, obviously, hearing and learning the teachings, through thought, that is reflecting on the teachings, reflecting on their meaning, and finally through vijnana, through consciousness, through actually realizing them in experience. So this is a set of epistemological qualities, which is talking about the means and ways in which spiritual truths are realized. All right. So I'm going to skip over that. I'm just going to check in the chat. Now, we're getting, yes. So we've got some nice little comments there. Okay, so some nice clarifying comments there by a few people. So thank you for that. Somebody has asked here, Al has asked if Yajnavalkya did arrive at this knowledge through meditation. Does that meditation have to be mystical? I think that again, given the time and place, right, the context in which Jayatilake was talking, mid 20th century, the way that they were using mystical at those days essentially basically meant meditation, really. So he wasn't necessarily meaning that you're sort of doing a seance and communing with the spirits or something like that. But basically he just means is it a meditative realization rather than a rational one. I think that's what he means. Okay. All right, good. So I'm just please if anybody has any questions, please do pop them into the chat and I'll get to them before we finish. Meanwhile, I will proceed to briefly look at some of the non-Vedic traditions in the time of the Buddha or the time previously before the Buddha. And the next chapter in Jayatilake talks about the materialist philosophers. Now, it is a unfortunately common mistake in modern times that people will often assume that materialism is a kind of modern thing. That, and I think because in Europe, atheistic philosophies were very much suppressed by the Catholic Church for a long time. And it was only recently that it became even respectable to even out yourself as an atheist, and it's still quite problematic in many places. But in India, that wasn't really the case. And there was a rather astonishing degree of freedom of thought in ancient India, and some of the philosophies are things that I don't think would really fly today. Like, I think you'd get banned from Facebook for saying some of the things that people were saying in ancient India. I mean, you know, they were saying, oh, you can sort of walk up the north side of the Ganges and just kill everybody and you won't be doing anything bad. And even if you reduce all sentient beings to just a quivering mass of flesh, then that's not, you're not making any demerit by doing that. I don't know, I kind of feel that promoting that kind of idea would be a bit, it'd get you cancelled fairly quickly these days. Anyway, so there was a great diversity and vibrancy of different thought and philosophy. And I think it's important to bear in mind that at the time of the Buddha, that these different philosophies had not yet been synthesized. And later generations, especially the great Hindu philosopher Shankara, maybe 1,000 years later or something, got many of these different philosophies and then synthesized them all under one huge umbrella and showed that they're all related and connected to each other, and they're all kind of, you know, part of that big family that we know today as Hinduism. So that synthesis had not occurred in the time of the Buddha. Many of the different philosophies existed, but they were quite separate things, and they were different schools of philosophy, and they didn't see themselves as being branches of the same school. They saw themselves as being very much in opposition. Okay. Okay, so Jayatilake begins. The impact of materialist thinking on the thought of the canon is strong, and it seems therefore desirable to study the epistemological doctrines of the materialist insofar as they seem to have a bearing on the thought of the canon. It's customary to regard materialism as a heterodox school which grew up in violent opposition to Vedic thought, but our study of the concept of lokayata has shown that materialist philosophy emerged within the Brahmanical fold as part of its logical and metaphysical lokayata speculations. Even scholars, we notice, trace the origins of materialist thinking to the thought of the early Upanishadic period. So, I mean, just again, a bit of background. One of the perennial frameworks for understanding early Indian philosophy is the relation between the Vedic traditions, which we've just been discussing, and the non-Vedic traditions. The Buddha frequently referred to the Samanas and Brahmanas, the Samanas being the non-Vedic traditions, of which the Buddha said he was one, and then the Vedic traditions. Historically, the Vedic traditions arrived in India through the incursions of the Indo-European peoples in the 1,000 years or so before the time of the Buddha, sort of a gradual migration of Indo-European peoples through India, which means when they came there that they interacted with the people who were already there, and in the philosophical sphere that there were people who already had their own practices and religions and ideas and so on. And so it's kind of a discussion amongst historians and philosophers as to what aspects grew up innately in India among the people who were already there, and which were introduced by the Brahmins. And of course, one of the things that complicates that is that, well, these are all people living side by side for hundreds of years. So they were all the ideas were mixing up. And so you find heterodox ideas emerging within the Brahmanical field, as Jayatilake points out here. Okay. Okay, so skipping forward to paragraph number 89, when we consider the epistemological theories of the various schools of materialists, we find that with regard to the opinions and theories held on the problem of the means of knowledge, it is possible to classify them into three groups. That is, those who upheld the validity of perception alone and denied inference and other forms of knowledge. Those who upheld the validity and priority of perception, but admitted inference in a limited sense, denying other forms of knowledge. And three, those who denied all means of knowledge, including perception. So here Jayatilake is subdividing the materialists into three different groups. And I'm going to just explain some of these terms because these are critical terms for the whole history of Indian epistemology. And that is the idea of perception and inference. By perception, what is meant here is not quite the same as like when we're talking about the suttas, we use the word perception to translate the Pali word sanya. All right, that's not what's being meant here. Okay, so sanya as perception means how you perceive something. So it means how your mind interprets the sense data and makes meaningful wholes out of the diversity of the sense data. This is what we're talking about when we talk about perception as sanya in the context of the suttas. What it means by perception here is the sense of perception in sense experience. Okay, so it's not talking about the way we interpret experience, but it's talking about the raw data of experience. And this is one of the great dualities or great dynamics in Indian epistemology, the relation between sense experience and inference. Yeah? And later philosophers, they would call it pachaka, is the direct experience of the senses, and anumana is the inference. And these ideas will come up again and again and again. We find them constantly referred to, either directly or indirectly in the suttas, and they came to define the different schools of Indian epistemology would each stake out a different way of relating these things. But everyone has to deal with these things, but the exact relationship between them is not entirely clear or obvious. And it's also, I think, should be clear that these things relate very closely to those two overall systems of epistemological philosophy in European philosophy. That is to say, the rationalists, beginning with Socrates, who derived knowledge from inference. Okay, we can begin by first principles, and through a process of deduction, we can arrive at the truth. So this is emphasizing that side of inference, and the empirical philosophy comes back to emphasizing experience, right? The actual evidence that we can gain ultimately through the senses. So again, any of the Indian philosophies will acknowledge these two things, but the relationship between them is different in the different systems. Okay. Right, where are we going? Sorry, lost my place here. All right, so again, I can't go into too much detail, unfortunately, with all of these things, but I'll just look at the next paragraph, where Jayatilake is discussing the first of those groups. So the first of the groups who only accepts the validity of perception and denies the validity of inference. So Jayatilake goes on to explain. So in the 14th century book, Madhava, the Sarva Darshana Sangraha, so again, this is 2000 years after the text we're talking about, which is the locus classicus for a clear and concise statement of what appears to be the widest known school of materialism. It is said that this school holds that perception is the only source of knowledge. Earlier in the Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha of Shankara, it is stated that according to the materialists, only the perceived exists, the unperceived does not exist by reason of its never having been perceived. Perhaps still earlier, so we're tracing from the 14th century to the 8th century, perhaps still earlier, in a reference to materialist doctrines where the account is not technical or elaborate, we find it said that the materialist held perception to be the only source of knowledge. Understand, intelligent one, that no one exists hereafter. Regard not that which is beyond the reach of your senses, but only that which is object of perception. It is not possible to determine how early this reference to the Ramayana could be, but this reference in the Ramayana. So that's a quote from the Ramayana. But it's not possible to determine how early this reference is, but we find that the theory set forth here is associated with materialist and is criticized in the Pali Nikayas. So it gives a reference to the Digha Nikaya. Kassapa is here arguing with the Kshatriya Payasi, who has performed a series of experiments. So the Payasi Sutta, one of the most interesting suttas in the Digha Nikaya, all based on the assumption that it's possible to verify the existence of a soul by sense experience. This shows indirectly that the materialists represented could only be satisfied by the evidence of the senses. The argument of the materialist is stated by his opponent as follows: I do not know this, I do not see this, therefore it does not exist. Ahang etang na janami, ahang etang na pasami, tasma tang natiti. This is countered by the argument that it is wrong to infer that I do not see X, that therefore X does not exist. An example is given of a man born blind who says he cannot see black or white forms of colors, stars, or sun and moon, and argues that since he does not see them, such things do not exist. Payasi is made to admit that such things do exist, and that therefore the argument that what one does not see does not exist is false. So this is you can see how these are really kind of fundamental discussions about the nature of epistemology. We trust what we can see, and yet if we want to insist on the primacy of sense experience alone, what about there's so many things that we can't know through our senses. And so these kinds of, what this is showing us is that these kinds of extreme views, right? The view that we can only rely on sense experience is an extreme view. And as somebody said in the comments here, some Buddhists seem to actively discourage knowledge as if it were going against insight and truth. And I think this is also true, that there's some people say it's only what you're seeing in the present moment. That's all that's real. And this kind of perspective is the problem with this kind of perspective is, of course, that there's some truth to it, right? I mean, there's some truth to the fact that what we can see and perceive through our senses is real and meaningful in a special way. But at the same time, if that is followed through too much, it becomes an extreme. And the Buddha was always steering in between or away from these extreme perspectives. So yes, sense experience is important. The meditative experience is important, but that doesn't mean that rationality is unimportant. Can we rely solely on rationality? No, we temper it with sense experience. We temper our own reflections with the reflections of wisdom of a teacher, right? But does that mean that we have to believe everything that a teacher says? No. These things always follow. There's always a balance between these different things, and working together in a specific way, which we'll learn more about as time goes on in the course, then they will lead to understanding. Okay, so thanks, Deepika's given a reference to the Payasi Sutta. Good. So Korakot asks, will we get to the skepticism and the Jains today? Yeah, it looks like we're not going to make it to the Jains, unfortunately. It's getting very close to 5 o'clock, so we should probably wrap up about then. We've briefly looked at 2 of those first 3 chapters, and the 3rd chapter, I believe, is talking about the Jains and the Ajivikas, who are some of the other schools that were around at the same time as the Buddha. Some of the differences, or one of the main differences between the Jain epistemology and the Buddhist epistemology, is that the Jains believed in omniscience. They believed that the Jains had this idea that we have, like what we call like our self or our soul, the Brahmins would call the Atman. But the conception of those things was a little bit different. The Jains believed that the soul, they called the soul the jiva, almost like the life force. And they believed that the jiva was a kind of inherently pure individual soul that each of us possesses. And they believe that that soul has a quality of knowing, right? So again, this is epistemology. The soul is a thing that knows, but that its capacity to know is darkened and clouded by karma, or as they would also call it, kilesa. That means that it's almost in a quasi-physical sense, that the soul is almost like a crystal. Think of the soul, think of the Jain soul as being like a crystal or a diamond that can be occluded by impurities that seep into it. So they would often call the asavas, is like almost the pollutants that would darken the radiance and the light of the soul. And so because of this was almost like a quasi-physical thing, it could be purified in quasi-physical ways as well. And whereas the Buddhists said we arrive at knowledge through knowledge. This is one of the innovations of the Buddha. We arrive at knowledge through knowledge. We learn, we study, we understand, and that wisdom gives rise to knowledge. The Jains said that we arrive at knowledge through pain. Yeah? Because our intrinsic nature is to know. The soul knows by itself. The problem is that it's clouded with all of this stuff. So remember that a lot of these things come from analogies with technology. And just as today we talk about like the mind as a computer, right? We analogize with technology. In those days, the most innovative, cutting-edge new technology was the smelting of iron and the ability to use fire in an incredibly intense way, intensify fire and control it. That was the defining technology of the age. To be able to, the Vedic age was a Bronze Age. The time of the Buddha was an Iron Age, and you had to be able to use fire, and also bricks and pottery. And so that analogy that you can see, that's how you transform dirty, clumpy lumps of rock, yeah, into this pure, shiny, malleable metal fire, more fire, bigger fire, longer fire, hotter fire. That's what we're going to have to do to ourselves. In here, this is like that lump of rock, which is dirty and so on. We've got to burn it. Tapas, yeah, the fire that is going to burn us from inside. And the tapas burns the soul, cooks it, cooks all of the impurities off, and leaves the soul ultimately as this pure, bright, shining knowing, which will be omniscient, will literally know everything. And this is an idea that the Buddha satirizes in the suttas. He says, your teacher, Mahavira, he says he knows everything all the time. And yet he walks into a village and gets bitten by a dog. And people say, why did you get bitten by a dog? Didn't you know it would be there? He said, no, I had to get bitten by a dog. That's why I got bitten by a dog. Anyway, I don't know, maybe he was right. So this is a kind of difference between the Jain idea and the Buddhist idea. And so other theories like the Ajivikas had another theory, like their idea was more fatalistic. So Ajivikas believed in determinism. They believed that we evolve towards knowledge in a way that's more or less fixed by the nature of the universe. It's like you throw out a ball of thread and it unwinds. So they believe that we would all get enlightened eventually. We just have to hang around for long enough. But they also did ascetic practices and so on. And people would say, why are you doing these ascetic practices? If your enlightenment is predetermined, they would say, we are predetermined to do these ascetic practices. Yes. Okay, so that's very, very brief summary of the epistemological philosophies of the Jains and the Ajivikas. And so again, the purpose of looking at these historical philosophies is to have some idea of the context within which the Buddha was teaching, to understand both that that context was very different from ours. The people he was talking to had very different ideas, and yet many of the underlying issues are the same as the kinds of issues that we're seeing today. And to me, it's always striking when you look at these ancient philosophies, whether it's in Indian philosophy or Greek philosophy or whatever, it's just incredible to me to see how the same issues keep coming up again and again and again. And so this is why that source of wisdom that we have in the suttas is a perennial well of wisdom for us to come back to and to draw from. And I'm aware that in this initial discussion, we haven't learnt a huge amount yet about the Buddha's theory of knowledge, so that will come in subsequent weeks. But if you are to remember one thing about the Buddha's approach to knowledge, then remember that the Buddha's approach to knowledge was reasonable and moderate. It was not extreme. And again, has been noted that in modern Buddhism, we do find extremes of philosophy sometimes. We find people who are like, present experience only, no thinking, no inference. And that's not what the Buddha taught. We find people who teach ideas like the no knowing mind was one I learned yesterday. No knowing mind. I don't even know what that is. So I guess I've qualified for having a no knowing mind. But again, that's... or another one, of course, is crazy wisdom. And crazy wisdom is not crazy wisdom. Crazy wisdom is actually just crazy. And when you see these kinds of things, I would also just encourage you to remember the lesson that we learned from the postmodernists, which is that knowledge and the means of knowledge is intrinsically linked to power. So when knowledge is destabilized in these kinds of ways, then what kinds of power does that enable? Yeah, by the people who have control of the truth. All right. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for all of your comments and support. So Rodrigo, you make a comment that if somebody wants to make a donation for myself or for my living expenses and so on, you can find those through our monastery website, Lokanta Vihara. But also, I'm very happy to see people making donations for the If people want to donate to sort of Central, they can go to sort of Central website. But I'm also very happy to see people giving donations to the Buddhist Library, because they need all our support as well. Okay, thank you everybody for your attention. And I am very happy to have been able to spend some time with you and to share with you. And look forward to seeing you again next week. And I do remember, as was mentioned at the beginning, to check back with the Buddhist Library website for the updated dates as time goes on. Okay, thank you so very much, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.